For this project, we're going to be creating a vector illustration using an existing historical portrait. You should have downloaded the Historical Portraits folder, and inside of this folder I'm giving you 5 different people to choose from. You only have to pick one of these portraits to work on for your project. So whichever one you want to work, that's the only one that you need to do. Each one has about the same amount of detail, and some of them have some unique challenges within their overall design. For my illustration, I'm going to be working with Benjamin Franklin. So I'm going to pull him down and work from that. To set up your document, let's go into Adobe Illustrator, then we'll go up to File, and let's create a new document. The size of your document needs to be 10 inches wide and 13 inches tall. Do make sure you're working in inches, and we only need one artboard for now. Also, we don't need any bleed, so we can keep that the same, but do make sure you're working in RGB color mode. Everything else can remain the same, and we can say Create to set up our document. The first thing we need to do is to import the picture that we're working from. So let's go to File, down to Place, and let's locate that picture. It should be in the Historical Portraits folder, and in my case I'm going to choose Franklin. With Franklin selected, do make sure your options are available, and let's put it inside of its own template layer. We'll say Place. Now by default this will place it in the center of my screen, but not necessarily the center of my document. So let's move it over. Access your Layers panel, and we're going to uncheck or unlock the layer. Let's drag this over to where it needs to be. And if necessary, we can also hold down Shift as we click and drag and let it fill up the majority of our page. Now the main thing I'm going to be focusing on is just his face. So if you want, you can make it much larger and crop off some of the clothing that he's wearing. As long as the majority of his face fills out the entire work area, that's what I'm looking for. So in that case, I think this will give us a pretty good portrait to work on. Once we've got that, I'm going to return to my Layers panel one more time and double click on the icon for our template layer. This will bring up the layer options, and I'm going to uncheck dimming the layer. This way I can see it at 100% of the color that we want to work in. Now that that's established, let's go down and lock down that template layer and return to layer 1. Now inside of layer 1, this is where we're going to use our pencil tool to draw off any major shapes that we see within our facial structure. So going over to our tool panel, select your pencil tool, and let's double click on it to open up the options for this tool, making sure everything's set up correctly. As far as the fidelity goes, I want this to be a little bit more accurate than smooth, so I'm going to push it closer to this end. For now, we're not going to fill in new strokes, but we will keep them selected, and we also want to be able to edit and close off the paths once they become, or once we draw close to those ends. Now with that set, we'll say OK. So to get started on it, I'm going to zoom in. And to use this technique, we don't want to have areas that are too large, but I'm looking for any area that has the same color and relative tone. And so, which means it doesn't get too light or too dark in difference. So if I'm looking at his face, for instance, I can see on his eyebrow up here, this is a good darker area shape. And I'm just kind of squinting my eyes and drawing off that particular shape. Once it's outlined, to pick up the color that's underneath it, we're going to swap over to our eyedropper tool and click in the middle of it to fill it in with that particular color. I can then swap back over to my pencil tool, hold down Command to deselect it, and repeat the process for each shape that we see. Now when I do draw these off, I'm careful to slightly overlap each individual shape. So with it highlighted there, we'll go back in, choose our eyedropper tool, and click in the middle of it, and it will pick up that shape as well. Repeating this process, you'll create almost a quilt patch-like effect over the entire face. Again, swapping back to my pencil tool. Now some good keyboard shortcuts to know. If you want to quickly select your pencil tool, that's the N on your keyboard, and to quickly select the eyedropper tool is the I tool. So I've hit N to select my pencil, going in here, See this as one solid shape. Hitting the eye, swapping over and getting my eyedropper tool, clicking there, and then clicking the N tool and holding down the Command key so I can click away and deselect that. Back and forth, working until the entire area is nice and filled in. All right, with all of the areas done, you can go to your Layers panel and turn off visibility for that template layer to see your final results. It's okay if you have a few areas that are still white that didn't overlap. Later on, we'll go back in and we'll fill in these areas. What we want to be able to do now is to add our brush strokes and add in all of the smaller details on top of this area. So returning to our Layers panel, I'm going to turn on visibility for my template layer. Also, while I'm down there, I'm going to unlock this layer and I'm going to make a copy of the template image that we have. In order to do this, select your black arrow selection tool, hold down the Option key as you click on the picture itself and drag it off to the left. When you hold Option, this will make a copy of it, and you should be able to click and drag. Notice now there's two different versions. If I turn off visibility, we've got one that's still in the same spot and another one that's off to the side. This will allow me to further trace off any details as necessary, but while also keeping a secondary copy that I can look at in order to add other details. With that done, let's go back to our Layers panel, and I'm going to lock down both of these layers. Let's make a new layer on top of layer 1, and let's call this the Details layer. Inside of here is where we're going to go back in and clean up any of the blending that we need to do and add the smaller details on top of it. Now I can open up my brushes and start to paint in those details. Going over to my toolbox, let's select our paintbrush tool, double click on it to open up the tool options, and I'm going to let my fidelity be a little bit more accurate. We don't want to fill in any of our brush strokes, and we can keep everything else the same. We'll say OK. To pick our brushes, let's go over to the Brushes panel. And the style of brush that's appropriate to use are the more artistic styles of brushes. So any of the bristles, the art brushes, even some of the calligraphic and scattering brushes can give you that artistic effect. Some of the more non-appropriate ones are these ones that have little patterns or shapes or repeating patterns. I want to choose one that gives me more of an acrylic or a paintbrush kind of feel. So I want to use some of these that have a little bit more texture to them. To find more brushes, you can always go down to your brush library menu, and from the drop-down menu you can go to Artistic, and these are the pre-ones that are already loaded into Adobe Illustrator. In my case, I'm going to use my paintbrush set. Remember, these will be open in their own individual panel, and from here you can pick and choose whatever brush that you want to use. When you select the brush, it's always important to test out before you start to use it. So with it selected, if I was to draw a line, I can see this line was created at 1/4 of a point. Here's what it would be at 100%. So it's a pretty large line. Also, when you paint, feel free to change up the opacity and sometimes the layer profile. So if I wanted to paint this and give it more of a tapered edge, I can do something like that and it'll get thicker and thinner. In my case, I'm going to keep it as a uniform profile, but I will keep the opacity relatively low so that I can build up some of the blending. We'll pull it down to about 50%. It all depends on the color that you're using and the kind of blend that you're trying to achieve. The final thing that you can do to blend in colors is to change your blending mode. If you click on the word opacity, you can get the different blending modes. Multiply will allow it to shade in, screen will lighten up areas, and overlay will work through the midtones. Depending on what you're doing, we may swap this up as we start to paint through. So I want to back out so I can see both of my paintings side by side. And I'm going to move my brushes down and out of the way for now. Let's dock them up here at the top. After doing a little bit of experimenting, I think I'm going to change my opacity by clicking on the opacities, the blending mode, to overlay. And I'm going to keep my actual opacity lower, closer to 20 to 50%. So around 30 for now should be okay. Finally, make sure that you're working in larger brush strokes for now, and then later on you can go back in and make them smaller for smaller details. In this case, if I wanted to blend in these larger areas, I've set my stroke size to about 2 to 3 points so that when I paint, you can see how it covers a larger area, and that's kind of what I want to achieve. I'm going to start off at the top. I'm eyeballing the color that I need. Not necessarily picking up the exact color directly from here, simply because I want to give it that painterly type of feel. And I'm not trying to add a bunch of strokes. Instead, I'm just hitting it a little bit at a time, and I'm letting the colors blend themselves. Now, if I do think it's a little bit too stark, this is where I can drop my opacity down, and I can let it blend in a little bit more natural that way. So working back and forth with these colors and their blending, give it that painterly feel until now you can start to see it's overlapping and blending really, really well. Work this process back and forth. Because we're working in overlay mode, this will allow your colors to blend together without necessarily getting too light or too dark, or losing any of the color that's underneath it as well. We're still working very broad, not going in and doing small details just yet. We're going to save that to the very end. What I'm looking for are just the basic colors and value tones. With this done, you can see now we've gone from a very rough sketch to a much more refined sketch. I still kept my brush strokes as minimal as possible, and I really wanted to be able to see its movement as they're flowing along. So I want to see the direction that the brushes are going rather than having a bunch of short, choppy strokes. We've got some longer and overlapping strokes. With that done, we can now go to our details layer, and I'm going to lock it down. Let's add one more layer on top, and I'm going to call this the finer details. Inside of this layer is where we can go in and really clean up the rough edges and smooth them out into smaller, finer details. This is especially helpful around the mouth and around the eyes, and to help define any other parts that need defining. To do this, I'm going to zoom in on his face, and we're going to work with the layer that's immediately below everything. So I'm actually going to turn off my layer 1. This is our rough initial layer. And now I can actually see all of the original on top of the details that I've painted. So I want to be able to see where those harder edges are for his eyes, for any major shadows, or any other parts that I think need to be painted. As we've done with the other ones, we want to use minimal brush strokes. So I'm not trying to do a bunch of brush strokes on top of this. I really just want to easily define just a few things with a few strokes. So with my paintbrush selected, I'm going to set my opacity at 100%, and depending on the size that I need, change up the size of my stroke. But I know from experience we're going to need it around really small, around 0.25 percentage. Also, I'm going to choose my color. So in this case, if I did the eyes, they're closer to black. I'm going to test out my brush. And let's see. I see under my opacity, I'm still on overlay mode. So I'm going to swap that back to normal. We want to be able to see just the brush stroke, and that's what we're wanting to see with that. Now from here, I can choose an appropriate brush that I think would give me the effect that I need, and go in and really clean up the look and feel of these parts. Let's even go a little bit thinner. So if you need to, you can dial in. In this case, I'll go, nope, excuse me, not 15%, but actually 0.15 points. There's that. Now when I go in and paint, it should give me a much thinner and easily controlled spot, which I like that. Choose the color that we need, paint on top of there. Maybe a few hits for the eyebrows and these shadows. But I want it to look almost impressionistic, so I don't mind seeing the strokes. I just don't want to see a lot of the strokes. I just want to use this to clean up the edges. Same way with the hair. The hair has a good direction to it, so I'm going to choose a color. In this case, it's more of a gray. It's a neutral gray. Ooh, too bright. We'll open up the actual color picker and get the color that I need from here. There we go. We'll add in a few highlight colors for him. Moving back down to the nose. Darker red, having trouble picking colors today. And then, of course, along his lips. So, just a few strokes to give me an idea of what the color could be or should be along this area. We want it to be impressionistic, so I can back out. Let's turn back on that original layer. Now I can see it starting to line back up. Let's go back up to the eye. The eye, it's very important to have that highlight. Let's add the highlight back into them. And maybe drop down the opacity just a bit. And add a highlight stroke on top of the eyes. We'll define the nose a little bit more. think he needs some more definition in highlights on top of his head. So the purpose of the finer details layer is simply to clean up your drawing and add smaller details in fewer brush strokes, but something that lets it paint in exactly what you need. Again, you can go back and turn on visibility of any of your layers if you need to see it, but this is where you go back and you clean up those parts. We'll back out. Also remember to vary up your brush. Sometimes if you use the same brush over and over again, you'll get some drastically predictable results. So I'm going to choose this thinner brush. It's a little bit more textured. I kind of liking that. Let's add that back in there. Let's also add a few more shadows to this edge. The majority of my stroke work is around his face, and that's where I want to keep it. You can see once I get into the clothes, the details start to become minimal and almost impressionistic down there. So it's almost, there's nothing to it. All right. With that done, we can turn off visibility for our background layer and see what he looks like just by himself. So now it's looking very, very painterly. This is the style that I'm trying to go for. The last thing we want to do is to add some sort of simple background to our painting. So with that done, let's create one more layer below all of the other layers, in this case layer 1. And this will be our new background layer, so I'll call it background. And from here we can also turn off visibility for our template. Now inside of this background layer, this is where we're going to clean up the background and give it some good contrast. Now if I do look at my original image, you can see there's a darker edge on the right side and lighter on the other side. So if I was to paint something, we're just going to grab a simple paintbrush. I'm going to lower the opacity down a good bit. And we're going to make it very, very broad. So I'm going to bump it up to about 9 or 10 points. Let's get a dark color so we can actually see it. And you can see how that is going to quickly paint in the background. At this time, this will also cover up any white spots or other areas that were inside of your drawing and painting area. So with this, I'm just going to go around, create some simple brush strokes that will fill in and work with the areas that we've got. Having that good bit of contrast, darker on this side to lighter on this side, is what we want for our final painting and for our final design. And don't forget, you can vary up the type of brush that you're working in, and even since it's the background, let's riff on some of the colors. All right, I'm liking what I have so far. Once you've reached a good stopping point for your painting, we can go into our Layers panel. Let's get rid of our template layer. So select it and hit the trash can. If you're given a warning saying, "Are you sure?" we'll say yes, and that will get rid of that. And I'm going to keep all of my layers on top of each other for now, just so I can see the setup for this. If you want to, you can also grab your pencil brush tool. And in my case, I'm going to assign it down at the very bottom, and I'm going to do it at the topmost layer. Whoops, do make sure you've got a appropriate pencil, not necessarily a brush. And add my signature down at the bottom. We'll make it white. To turn this in, I want to see the Adobe Illustrator files. Let's go up to File and do a Save. Do make sure that you've added your name to the beginning of it. You can call this a historical portrait. And the format is saved as Adobe Illustrator. We'll hit Save. Since I've already got one saved up, we'll just go ahead and go with this one and save that up and upload this Adobe Illustrator file.